Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, yeah, I remember you now. You sat right in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
All right, the recording's going, Joey, so you can start whenever you would like.
Oh, 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 it got real serious real fast.
I can edit it
Okay.
so that it like if you want to just wait a
No, no,
couple
no, I want
minutes.
that left in.
Okay.
Um,
You
okay.
can't say that
I
on a
have,
recording.
Only 2 slides until my boy
okay.
is on screen.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So I tried to structure this, uh, at least I'm hoping to structure this similar to how the open source class is structured. So one of the kind of newer electives, and Dr. Thomas has been running it, uh, is an open source software class. And essentially, the whole class is each class, one person presents a paper that was sent out to everyone. So everybody reads the paper between each class. So it's 2 papers a week. You write up a 1 page summary of the paper. And then one person round robin, you go through the class. Every class, a different person presents. And it's usually maybe a 30-minute presentation or however long the paper was. Maybe if it's a longer paper, it's a longer presentation. If it's a short paper, you can get away with a little bit less. And then the majority of the class is just an open forum of discussing the paper, the material itself, whether or not it was a well-written paper, whether the figures were good, or or looking at open source as a whole and free software and figuring out what it is, the nuances of it, and how can we use it. And so it's been a it's a fun class, and I recommend taking it. Um, but a lot of this is kind of preliminary stuff. At least I've kind of tried to cut stuff together. The presentation I had to do was on. It's actually a movie, so we don't. It wasn't just papers. There are some other materials that we go through. But this movie is Revolution OS, and then I've also included some extra notes on free and open source software, or FOSS. So the whole movie is kind of set up like a timeline for the most part. And so I went through a whole bunch of things. I think I cut out a couple in these slides, but we can jump right in with the kind of the first big point of the movie, and really kind of a foundational point for open source where it kind of came to a head was Bill Gates' letter, an open letter to hobbyists, from in 1976. So before this point, pretty much all software was just being shared freely between people. And it was, in some ways, kind of being stolen from the major companies that were starting to rise, like Microsoft. Obviously, was one of the big players, which is kind of why Bill Gates was a big, uh, kind of the big person to try and go up and say, "Hey, you guys should pay for software." And some of the main quotes are, how do you expect good software to be made if people aren't willing to pay for it?
Don't copy that floppy.
Don't copy that floppy. Yes. But it's this kind of it's the idea of how can we do professional work for nothing? And if everybody just shares everything, how are we going to have software companies be able to grow in any meaningful way? If we just give everything away for free, it's going to be pretty hard to set up a company around it and have people put bread on the table at the end of the day. So a lot of people did not like this for obvious reasons, because they had just been sharing their software before, and they thought, well, if we're doing stuff and we're just freely sharing things between each other, then we should just be allowed to do it, because it's just software and it's ones and zeros. uh, you know so what's the point? um, and so you also have to think about what the computing was at this point. 1976, we weren't at the point yet where everybody was starting to have their own computers. So it made sense at the beginning, when there were only a handful of mainframes, that that those people were working together, because essentially you had to write a whole program yourself every time you wanted software. So in the beginning it made sense, and it was kind of a necessity for people to share code. But as we've started to move through, and people start trying to make proprietary software and trying to make money from the software itself, it hurts those companies if everybody just shares the program with each other. And so that's where we get into Richard Stallman. This man right here, love him or hate him, started the GNU project. GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix. And essentially, well, one, it's a recursive acronym, which is always enjoyable in the software community. But essentially, he was laying the groundwork for the free software movement, and that movement, which we'll get into in a sec, is all about free software. And it's not actually free as in beer; it's free as in freedom, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the software was not in public domain; it was using copyleft, which means the software he was trying to write was not just open to everybody, but it was open to everyone, and it was always going to be open to everyone. And anybody who made changes also had to make their changes open to everyone. And so that's a very, it's a whole flip on copyright, which is it's proprietary. You can't share it with anyone, and if you make changes, you're not allowed to. But so we have free software. Made a little aside. The GNU's Not Unix is essentially just kind of a set of tools that's used on top of the Unix kernel that they were working on, and eventually they moved to the Linux kernel because their kernel they weren't progressing on it enough, and Linux was able to overtake it. Okay, quick, what is free software? Now, this is different than open source software because open source doesn't show up for a bit. Free software is free as in free speech, not as in free beer. And these are all quotes directly from the GNU website and the free software movement. These are the actual freedoms. Obviously, they're zero indexed because this is for programmers. It also means that you should have the freedom to run a program as you wish for any purpose. You should have the freedom to study the program and access the source code, and the freedom to redistribute and help others, and the freedom to distribute modified versions and let the community benefit from your changes. This is about freedom, and that the proprietary software, there's two kinds of software. There's software that you control because you have the access to the source code, or there's software that controls you, which is something like Windows, where Windows can push updates that maybe I don't want, or it can force me to I can't add features that I want, and I can't remove features that I might want to remove. It forces me with what software I have to use. And in Richard Stallman's view, that is unethical and should be removed at all cost. So that's a hefty statement. It's all about freedom. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe we should just have free software. Okay, enough of that little aside. So Linux was started in 1991. So this is 2 years after GNU started, and it surpasses the GNU Hurd, which is the microkernel, the GNU project. Basically, Linux, if you don't know, is an operating system. Technically, it's the kernel of the operating system. At least that's the main project that they work on. And what it does is it is essentially the core part of the machine that is what's distributing out resources for other programs. And if you can have a free version, which is what Linux is, it's a free version of an operating system. Unlike if you wanted to use Windows, you have to pay for it. If you want to use Mac OS, you actually have to buy their device anyways. But it's a free piece of software, and it's open source, so anybody can access the source code and anyone can change it. And it's under the GNU public license, so it is part of the partly free software, but it's little nuances. It's on the version 2 of the license and not version 3, and we can talk about that if people are interested. So now we're starting to get into licensing, and I mentioned a little bit about how the software isn't in public domain, and it's not it's different than public domain. It's different than copyright. It's not proprietary. it's what's called copy left. And so they have the copy left symbol, which is the copyright, but flip, which is always entertaining. But some of the big things, this is straight from the GitHub website for how to pick a license. The main things that you kind of look for in a license are if there's already a license there for something you want to work with, usually you're just going to have to probably try and stick with that. And there's a lot of work to try and figure out what licenses are compatible with what other licenses. So that's a whole thing you have to look into. Maybe you want your software to just be anybody can use it for anything. So specifically like the MIT license, you're allowed to use code that was provided under an MIT license, and you're allowed to use that. You're allowed to use that for proprietary software. And then other things like the GNU public license, the GPL, is you care about sharing improvements. So that means that anybody that makes changes to the code also has to make those changes under the GNU public license. They can't have proprietary changes. So that's kind of an important thing. That's a big difference from letting anybody use it for anything or saying all changes have to be available to everyone is a very big difference. And where you draw that line for software and what software should be under what is very personal. And so, you know, some of my projects are under MIT, some of them are under the GNU public license. And it's once you set it, theoretically you can change it. But the other thing to note is that as people contribute to a project, their code will be under whatever license the project is under, which means if you do change a license after that, you have to have everybody who's contributed code, because their code is under their own license under their names, they all have to have a say in what licenses it is. So it's a lot of work. At the beginning, it's very confusing, but there's a lot of helpful stuff out there for figuring out what license you should use, and a lot of them are, some of them are very short and simple, and other ones people have documented enough that you can understand it pretty quickly. So, and then beyond that, there's other things. Maybe you don't want to choose a license. You can look at what happens. But so licensing is a whole thing in itself, and it's a whole discussion you could have. Beyond that, so we kind of talked at the beginning how free software, sure, it meant free as in freedom, not free as in free beer. But, you know, if the source code's available to everyone, the free as in free beer kind of comes along. So the question is, how did anybody make money on free software? And one of the big things you can do with free software is, well, okay, so maybe the source code's free, but just downloading a piece of software is only half the battle. The other half of it is, well, one, there's maintaining it, and two, there's how do you support it for people? Like, what happens when their system breaks and they need help fixing it, and maybe they don't want to go through all the source code to find their bug and then submit the bug. You can hire other people to do that. And that was one of the things that Red Hat, starting in 1993, they created their own Linux distribution, which became the Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And their entire business model was on professional quality assurance. So their distribution was set to be high quality, and it was based in open source software, and they gave professional level support to companies that would, invest in their support. And I thought it was interesting. So originally it was kind of forked straight from the Linux kernel, but now it's actually the newer versions of this distribution are actually based on another distribution that's had its own set of open source changes, which is pretty interesting that their software is now not just based on one project, but it's based on a long history of years of changes that they're now kind of contributing to. But they provide the assistance for companies, because obviously if something breaks, it's a lot of work to try and fix it. So that's kind of cool. what else can we do with open source software? This is kind of fun. Technically, it's all free software so far because we we still haven't actually gotten to open source software. So there's a whole history before open source is even started. We have the Apache web server. Now, I'm not a web guy at all, but Apache, so it handles HTTP requests and it runs on the Linux OS, which means we now have something that's really powerful because, this web servers, we're hitting late 90s. The internet is a thing. It's getting exciting. And we're going to want to start serving up some web pages. And now I can set up a web server if I have the equipment. You can set it up for basically free because, at least in terms of software, it's free. Now, obviously, getting the maintenance and having people support it is going to take work, and that means you have to pay people for that work. But the initial code itself is free, unlike the other options like Microsoft, Sun Systems, Google Systems. You can see Apache had well over 50% of the market. Well, it had a solid chunk over 50% of the market in terms of the web servers for, let's see, how long is this? At least, let's see here. We can see it going over 50 and 98-ish. And it stayed that way till about 2014. So that's about 15 years of reign in the web server space. And that's a long time, especially for a free piece of software that it's not like people are getting paid to contribute to it, really, when you get down to it. So that's pretty awesome. We have free software that just runs the internet. That's
Remember
pretty
to
cool.
tip your servers.
I see what you did there. That was pretty good. The next thing, there's a bit more in here. So Netscape also goes open source. So Netscape was a browser for us youngins. Kyle, I know you know a lot more about Netscape than the rest of us, so that's okay. But so the Netscape Navigator browser, which eventually becomes Mozilla and Firefox, which I didn't actually know, they brought a lot of public attention by going free and open source because Microsoft was progressively controlling more and more of the market with Internet Explorer, and there was the possibility that Microsoft could control enough of the market they could just box everyone out of the browser market just because they had so much. And so by going open source, it made their browser free for people to get, and that was able to kind of hold Microsoft back at least a little bit. They were inspired by this paper, The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric Raymond, which is it's kind of like the kickoff to open source really kind of jumping out. Obviously, we had the free software movement, but kind of just this idea of looking at open source and sharing it to the world outside of just the community of who's already in open source. This paper it's a kind of his own personal musings on open source, and it's a good read. But so we've kind of started getting into open source, but we haven't actually defined it. And in 1998 is when we finally define it, which is, what is that? 15 years after GNU has started and free software is a thing, we finally get to open source, which in a lot of ways is just a looser definition. It's not even really a similar thing in terms of a definition. Free software, you can think about, is an ethical movement in a lot of ways. It's about freedom, and it's the fact that the source code is open is kind of just a side effect of making sure your software is free. And free as in free speech, not free as in free beer there. And the free as in free beer is also just a simple consequence of it being open to everyone to be able to see. So open source kind of just takes a guidelines definition for this is what makes it open source. And it really is just about the source code is open and it's available to everyone and people can make changes. And that's it. It's not about freedom. It's just about the open source is available to people. So that's the difference, is free software is a lot more of an ethical movement, and it's a lot more of a restrictive definition on open source, whereas the actual open source definition is just a set of guidelines of, do you check all these boxes that your source code is open? And that kind of nuanced difference is actually pretty important when one of them is really just an ethical discussion, the other one is just a check the boxes type definition. So the things, obviously, free redistribution and the source code being easily distributed. Derived works can be allowed. The integrity of the author's source code means that when somebody makes source code, you have to provide their source code as their own thing. They have the right to basically say this was theirs first and it's under their license, and then from there you can add your stuff however you feel necessary. You can't discriminate against persons or fields. So the example in their definition on their website is basically, you can't stop the anti-abortionist standing outside the clinic, and you also can't stop the people in the abortion clinic. You can't do either. It has to be open to everyone, which means there's actually some licenses now that that might be, quote, open source, but they actually are limited to certain groups of people, and that's things like there's a Hippocratic license, which states it can only be used for good. Of course, then everybody's definition of good might be different, but that's kind of its own discussion. Then we have the distribution of the license should be with the code. The license must not be specific to the product and must not restrict other software. So the key thing with this is that if I have a CD with code on it for one project, it can't also restrict other pieces of software on that CD, which is kind of a obscure thing, but it's important to know that it can't restrict other pieces of software. And then these are all kind of been based off the Debian Free Software Guidelines, which is a fork of Linux, which was from the which was under the GPL. So it all kind of goes back to free software, and there's this whole kind of web of how we get to open source.
So you said that you can add to an author's existing source code. You can also delete, right? And that doesn't violate the definition of open source?
Yeah, as long as you source the original works.
Got it. Okay.
If you just take their stuff, say it's yours, and change it, then that's not allowed.
Makes sense.
Which is why, like, if you just like fork a project and start deleting unnecessary pieces, that's fine, because when you forked it, you've inherently connected it to the original project. At least when you do it on like GitHub or something like that. And that's why Git is really nice, because it does all this work of maintaining all these guidelines for you, as well as being source control is its own excellent tool.
May I interject for a bit?
Please do.
So last I recall, Git stores all changes you make quite literally as the individual changes per commit. Is this correct?
That sounds right in my head.
So basically, when you fork off of someone else's project, you get a list of every change from the beginning, and then you append your own, and that defines your fork of their project. Is that correct?
I can't remember if the fork includes all of the previous changes.
Well, I mean, all the previous changes up to the point where you fork off of.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it actually does. I don't know if you can revert to commits prior to the fork.
Thought that was interesting. Sorry.
No, yeah. That would be something to look at. But okay, so what are the last things? I thought that it was kind of important to include that there have been companies that have gone and made money from free software and open source software, which, at least when I first heard that, I thought it was kind of like, huh, that's pretty cool. The fact that you can make money from something that's absolutely free. And really you just do it with support, because companies need support. So the two companies that this movie kind of went into, because all of this was from, one movie, looks at Red Hat and VA Linux. And so Red Hat was the first Linux company to go public. They had huge initial success. And VA Linux, I can't exactly I think they mainly just did support of various systems. And they had extremely huge initial success when they went public, setting a record at the time for first day increase on the NASDAQ.
That's crazy.
So that's pretty good. Like that 700% in the first day is pretty good. But of course, with the .com bubble, those faded, and so Red Hat was bought by IBM last year. I mean, $34 billion ain't too shabby for something that was running on free software. Eventually, VA Linux became GeekNet, and then that was acquired by GameStop in 2015, and they were making games by the time they were acquired. So they went their own way. Red Hat still around, still doing. I don't know. It's bought by IBM now. I don't know how free their software is anymore. No, it's still free. Still under the GPL. So, okay, that lasted exactly half an hour, which is exactly what I would have hoped for. Because the rest of this is just an open discussion. There's a whole bunch. We kind of just glazed over like what things mean, and so we can start to try and get into. There's a lot of discussion on how you can use open source. So there's a lot of it is what role can open source play? Are there particular industries that it works well with? So humanitarian projects. Free software is pretty nice for third world countries that can't afford to hire software developers. That's definitely something to think about. But how can we use this in business and the ethics of proprietary software? If we asked Richard Stallman, he'd say that proprietary software is terrible and we should never use it. It's morally wrong. How should we go about that? There's few people that are as strong as him, so we can look at that. And then how should developers contribute? Should we all be contributing? Should we contribute more? Does it really matter? And what licenses should we use? What part of software is copyrightable? Is a whole nother discussion that kind of plays into how much things can open source do. So yeah, this can go in whatever direction people want to take it.
Can I copyright my Thomas projects?
Yes,
probably.
you totally could. I know I do. They're just not openly available. So, what the heck?
I see the C++ Stallman has arrived.
Yes. Brendan, big question. Big question. Is proprietary software morally wrong? Dude, we can hear your mic.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear your mechanical keyboard.
Oh, I don't think he can hear us.
Oh.
Well, while we wait,
Yeah.
I just want to point out that I think that copyleft is actually it goes against the whole point because it restricts you from profiting from your own work, which is the problem I have with proprietary software. Because the biggest problem with proprietary software is that the people who actually wrote it don't benefit from it directly.
Yeah, oftentimes it's just that they end up getting runoff from the people who hired them to write, at which point we then ask the question, when does ownership become relevant to who created it?
Sorry, I'm back.
Hello.
Is that the train you were going down, Kyle?
Yeah, sort of, but particularly going on copyleft, I have serious reservations about it.
So, I mean, at least with if you're working as a developer in a company, you get the trickle off because, and a lot of times, rarely is the developer selling the code. But there is a whole lot of stuff where, in copyleft, where you can just have people freely using your code and you can't get any benefits from it, just because people
Right.
can just download it.
which is why I prefer the BSD license.
BSD license.
It's very
I like-
similar to the Apache license, except you can patent it.
Yeah, I think the MIT license should be similar, I think.
MIT basically says use it however you want and do whatever you want, but I have no liability.
Yeah.
Which is what freedom should be.
But then people can take your software and make changes and not share it with people.
That's not freedom.
You're gonna keep things away from me?
What I'm saying is that copyleft is not freedom. It's saying that it's freedom, free as in freedom, but you can't reuse this unless it's free. That doesn't benefit mankind.
By imposing restrictions, you are inherently making something not free in a sense.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to say.
Sorry if it was a bit of like stealing your thunder. I thought that was what you're trying to get.
That was what I was getting at, but my son tried to stick his fingers in a electrical socket, so
Oh.
kind of got thrown off.
That's a good point. There's a few. Okay, so the first ones were, have you heard of free software and do you know the difference? Hopefully now people know a little bit more. What other things? Some of you guys have contributed to open source or free software. Actually, pretty good number. So that's pretty cool.
Technically, wouldn't anyone who has any contributions to a project on GitHub automatically have contribution to open source or free software? As long as it's not for like a workplace project?
Usually, yeah. Yeah. That's why. Not unless you assign one.
Do I need to go to any particular bureaus about it, or do I just need to attach a document that says, hey, this thing is applicable to the MIT license or to this other license?
So actually, yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
I was just going to say what you said, like what the second part was.
Yeah. Here, actually, new repository. When you make a new repository, test, cool. At the beginning, you can choose a license right at the beginning, and there's the whole list of a bunch of licenses that you can choose from. And if you don't choose a license and you create the repository, what you can do is you can go. Oh, do I have to make something first? I think you might have to set up stuff first, but you should be able to go to like settings, or you can add a license after the fact as well. And GitHub is really nice about figuring it out.
Can I just make my own license?
Good luck.
Yes.
Don't mess it up. I think the point of having a license is it covers all the bases. You don't have to be worried about missing something or
right.
It covers all the bases, and it makes it easier for to figure out how other licenses can work together.
Got it. Okay.
Make sure that before you propose it into existence with an actual bureau that would maintain or at the very least enforce it, that you and they both understand extremely clearly what the bounds are and are not, and any possible, loopholes are snuffed out before they begin.
That's a good question. How is this enforced?
That's an excellent question. Let me check something.
I believe it's covered under copyright laws.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know if there has actually been a court case over a license.
If someone did it, it was Oracle.
If there's anything I've learned from being a computer science major, it's that if there's a loophole, a lawyer will find it, but chances are a programmer found it first.
And Oracle sued over it.
Yes. well, there's the Oracle versus Google is a big, long, and confusing one. But that one specifically talks about whether or not APIs are copyrightable. Which is a confusing thing, and I believe the final decision was that no, at one point they sided with Google saying that APIs are not copyrightable. But it's a long thing that would be its own discussion. I don't remember all the nuances.
Yeah, it's going to the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
it's gotta be a hard thing to convey to people who are not necessarily, they don't necessarily have a technical background sometimes.
Well, the original judge on the case actually taught himself Java to be able to not compete, but competently judge the case on the facts.
Really? Wow.
Yes, and that was the thing. Yes. So I personally think that Oracle is just one of those software companies that's they do a lot of stuff like that. It's not just the Google one. They've done a lot of crazy things.
Yeah. As a contract litigation.
Well, there's Free Software Foundation versus Cisco.
This should be good. So the various products sold by Cisco under Linsky's had violated the licensing terms of the Free Software Foundation held copyright, including GCC. So they sold copyleft software, which you are not allowed to sell. At least you shouldn't be allowed to sell. That's the settlement that included Cisco appointing a director to ensure products comply with free software licenses. Cisco undisclosed financial contributions to the Free Software Foundation.
Okay.
I just had an idea, and it might just be that I'm seeing what seems like it in front of me. What if the copyleft license was just so that unsavvy companies could be caught off guard and then either sued or settled out of court for the benefit of the inventor of the copyleft?
If you know enough about software to know how to get free software and sell it, you're competent enough to understand that you shouldn't be selling it. But yeah. Megan, I would love to hear your input. I know you're not a huge software person yet, but we try and get everybody in the conversation.
Yeah, I don't know that much.
How does it make you feel?
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn.
Well, I mean, not the software thing, but I mean, on a philosophical level, do you think that
proprietary software?
Yeah, stuff like that. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I think my answer was, I don't know, I don't think it's wrong. I think I put neutral because I wasn't exactly sure about that before.
Sure.
That's so fair. I still do not quite understand his arguments as to why proprietary software is morally wrong. Is it mostly because of the fact, like you guys were saying, like when you have big companies, you have a bunch of people writing your software. So, use Windows as an example, and they only get like the trickle down profits from it.
With Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation, it is all about the ability to control your own machine and not let another company control the software. By turn, they're going to be controlling you. about.
So, what are your thoughts on things like cars? A car manufacturer would not want you to change your car because if something went wrong and killed you, they could be held responsible, possibly. Does that make a difference in your thought? I work for a medical company, so like I would never want someone touching our software. I know how important things are and to be working properly, and we mess up even a little bit and you can end up killing someone.
Yes. So,
Sure, but that's more of an apples and oranges comparison because for the vast majority of software, it's not in, you know, software is not protecting life and limb. So, like,
Understood, but what he was, I don't know what the quote was exactly, but someone was saying proprietary software is morally wrong. Is that he's saying that in all cases, or was he just referencing more like operating systems and associated software?
I'm pretty sure he means in all cases.
So like,
yeah, that's how I read it too.
so even in that case though, so say Brendan's company is writing code for the medical devices, that just means that they just have to make it open to everybody. They themselves are writing the code and putting it on the machine and it's running, so that's not threatening. But I guess what would be threatening would be if somebody went to the machine, got the source code, changed it themselves, and was there modifying the product. That would be a problem.
Right, which, if you like, for instance, let's take the case of, like, I don't know, a pacemaker, right? Let's say I'm not really too familiar with the inner workings of a pacemaker, but let's say it has a microcontroller or something in there that controls timing and stuff like that, sensors. Uh, Open source software wouldn't necessarily be a danger there because the only way that it would be implanted is if it were passed, it was not just cleared by the FDA, but FDA approved and vetted, you know.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying is, open source software doesn't necessarily pose a risk in that case, because you have to have access to the means that it would pose a risk. And the software itself is not the implanted part.
Okay.
So, in the case of vehicles and the software on them, what are your thoughts on modifying? Because a user can modify it without having to go through any regulating agency.
Sure.
You can change the software in your car, and I don't know what the laws are, so I don't know if the car manufacturer could be held responsible for something that went wrong. But I know that that's been part of the pushback against the right to repair movement. So,
well, a good example of what you're talking about is, I believe
Tesla.
It was, I want to say it was Keysight that made a series of oscilloscopes that had a locked function that was locked out in software, and if you were able to hack into it with JTagging, you were actually able to change that and expand its capabilities to the scope that was 2-3 times more expensive. So
sort of like Tesla, I think someone mentioned that locking out heated seats in software. Hardware's there.
and that is a good example of when software is not doing anything but limiting you.
I do like the idea behind if I buy a car, I can modify the car. I can modify the code. I can modify just what engine. I can swap out the engine if I want. If I was to do something like that and make changes, then it's no longer the company who sold me. Like, I understand why the warranty would be voided or whatever. They can't be faulted for problems that are created by the changes that I made. So I understand why warranties would be voided. But like I was saying, I like the idea that you can, if you buy a thing, you can modify it and change it however you want. But I also understand proprietary software is also needed so that you can make a profit on the things that you're making. So, as somebody who likes to tinker with the things that I have around me and make changes and whatever, like I like the ability to repair stuff and go in and see like all of the details of the code and change it if I have to. But at the same time, from a business perspective, it you got to be able to make money. So it's a hard thing to say.
I look at it like I look at textbooks. Why should I have to pay $130 for a PDF copy of my textbook when the hard copy is $200? It doesn't cost them a dime to copy a file, so they're getting more than more than they put in per PDF, even though they're charging almost a full price for a book. With textbooks, they use the justification that they have to cover printing costs, but there's no justification for PDFs. So my point is that sometimes proprietary software is made expensive for no reason other than the fact that they can sell it for that much, and that's why it's morally wrong.
Right. I see.
Well, and nowadays with textbooks, they can just say, "Oh, it has to be expensive," because so many people are stealing the books for free.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I would like to say that piracy does not directly affect sales.
Correct.
Yeah.
People who pirate the things are generally not going to pay them anyway.
In fact, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting a bit, but I received recently a version of a textbook that was an international one that was, quote, not to be distributed outside of the Indian subcontinent. And
Same.
Yeah, good luck with that.
It was also a month late, but that's enough of that point. It was almost 10% of the price of what would have been expected of the hard copy of the third edition of the book, and it was sold to me for $20.
That's my point.
Sorry if I'm
No, you're fine. I was just saying that's exactly my point. That goes exactly to what I was just saying.
I don't know. Like,
So yeah,
if I put the time and effort into making a book though as an author and then getting it published and everything, like it's my product. If I want to sell it for however much I want, I can. But it gets into a harder, like it gets to the point of like where you're talking if it's morally wrong if like that's the only product that you have the option of getting because like that's what the college chose and everything, and then you're kind of profiting.
I think that you're missing a big thing though, Josh. Who profits the most from that book? Do you think it's? Oh, hold on.
Probably the publisher.
Yeah, which one do you think makes more money? The guy who wrote my calculus textbook or Pearson?
Pearson.
Exactly. And that's wrong. They didn't do it. They just literally own paper. That's what they do professionally. They own paper.
Well, and they formatted it.
Oh yeah, that makes
that's
organizing stuff is pretty tricky.
It can
it's
be.
like a couple days of work, buddy.
Revising stuff is pretty tricky. Sorry, may I interject?
Yes.
Just go. You're fine.
Revising stuff is pretty tricky, but here's the thing. As a person who has experience writing what's essentially a small summary of engineering statistics that I have on my GitHub page in LaTeX, all you have to do to rearrange sections is copy, paste, over and over again. Maybe put in a couple new problems so that you can say it's a new product, and then resell it for the same price, if not more, adjusted for the new, the new price level.
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear that. I was getting a news update.
The entire thing?
Just the last part.
Oh, you just have to adjust the price for the new price level, put in some new stuff in there so that you can say it's a new product, slap on N+1th edition, maybe put on a new cover art, copy paste some sections into new places, maybe add a new section or an addendum that would have actually been helpful in previous editions, and then boom, it's off to the races. You may now exploit the populace.
That's actually exactly what I'm saying. I mean, it's the people who write the software themselves are not the ones who are in any ethical violation. It's the people who profit from it, namely the companies that employ the people who wrote it.
So they have too many people working for them?
Could you say that again?
They must have a lot of people working for them.
Right, but let's say they're all paid $20 an hour, no matter if they're making code or debugging or whatever. If they have to write a new operating system, they're still going to have to they're going to be paid the same no matter how much work they're putting in. You know what I mean? And assuming they don't get bonuses or dividends or anything like that from sales, or it's essentially theft. Now put this into your head. Imagine you're in an unpaid internship and you write a new algorithm that speeds up whatever you're doing like by 20 to 30%, and you have no rights to that software. They don't have to compensate you in any way. That's theft.
I get that, but like when you signed on to to do that, to be the unpaid intern, like you agreed to those terms.
Right, and why do we have to agree to that? Because if we do something that's worthwhile, they can steal it.
Everyone else also has the same terms set. So our choices are make our own company where we can then sell them with the zero legal acumen we have, or just deal with it, bite the bullet, and give our intellectual properties to someone who knows next to nothing about software.
That's right. And with proprietary software, the ownership of software is not necessarily wrong. I want to just clarify that I'm not saying that people can't own software. I disagree with Richard Stallman vigorously on it. It's just that I disagree with who owns the software.
Wait, so you think that like if someone in a company creates like some piece of software, they should have the right to say I want to give it, whether they want to give it to this company or not?
That's how patents work.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, if you do something and you patent it, then you have to either sell or allow the company to be a patent holder. You know, that's kind of my point.
So it's much more like you're acting like I guess a subcontractor, writing useful bits of code, patenting it as your own, and then selling the rights to it to the larger company for them to use.
Right. Because as engineers, we create things. We are the means of production. We're not working on an assembly line. We create things. The company doesn't. They sell our ideas.
Well, if you're going to work like that, if a company is going to work like that and employees can choose whether they want to contribute to the company, from a company perspective, whatever they're trying to sell, it's just not going to work because they can't guarantee that their employees are going to help them in any case. I don't know. It just seems like if that were the case everywhere, then things wouldn't get done as efficiently.
You'd be surprised. I mean, Linux is still around, right?
I'm not really familiar with Linux and how that works. Company works.
No, what I'm saying is that it's not just one person or one team of people that's maintaining it. You know, I mean, there's millions of people across the globe that are contributing to it.
Yeah, but Linux is definitely not the standard open source project, and not many people get paid to make Linux still work.
Right, and I'm not saying that that's something that someone is profiting on. I'm saying that, okay, hold on. I just got a little dizzy. Sorry. Let me.
You okay there?
Yeah, I didn't sleep well last night. What was I talking about?
How Linux still runs and how that is an example of how you can still have good software. But I think Luke's point was that it's hard to have a business unless it's built on the foundation of all the software developers are essentially just software contractors, which I don't think works very well um, as a business model.
I see. Okay. Well, what I'm trying to say is that, like, with just give me a second. I have an example. Just give me 1 second.
I was thinking about the car thing, and I would think that laws for how you can adjust the software in your car would probably end up being something similar to the rules and regulations for modifying a gun.
Oh, really? I'm not
Well,
familiar with the ones for modifying guns.
like you can't saw off the head of a shotgun.
Oh,
okay?
right. Yeah, it's just straight up illegal.
What effect is
Yeah.
that supposed to have? I actually don't know this.
I think it just makes it a wider shot, but I'm not a gun guy.
But wouldn't that also make it less powerful?
It makes it a different weapon technically.
Yeah.
Much more easy to conceal. Yeah. Carry
Um,
around.
Well, by that reasoning, you wouldn't be allowed to just let something not be cleaned for a significant period of time, because wouldn't that turn your gun into a different weapon?
No, it's dirty.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, what?
No, it's the same weapon. It's just dirty.
Yeah, there's a set of rules for what things you can and can't do to various firearms. And you can look them up, but I would assume that eventually we'd need hardware and software modifications for cars that will be the same kind of idea. Because as far as I'm concerned, a car is about as deadly as a gun, just in different ways.
Right.
I can understand the whole right to repair thing backfiring in the case of cars or in the case of specific appliances, but in the case of one of the source, fields, a cell phone is not nearly as vulnerable to, taking out a human life or significantly injuring someone, except in maybe the case of its hardware.
Yeah,
However,
but
at the same time, a negative detractor, a literal punishment mechanism implemented, which, by the way, has been documented, to someone opening up their phone being a fuse blowing itself, that is quite literally just self-destructing because someone decided to open it.
well, what's worse? Having your phone blow up and maybe, let's just say it takes out your whole leg. Or I could just take out all of the money you could ever have in your bank account and all the money you will ever have, and I'll sign up for as many credit cards as I can in your name, and I'll stalk you for the rest of your life, because I can, because I know how computers work. I don't know how you can compare the two. There really isn't a way, as far as I'm concerned, but they're both pretty bad.
I see
And
what
so
you're
there
saying.
needs to be adequate measures, which is why you can't just start stealing people's data.
Right.
Um,
The example I wanted to give was the transistor at Bell Labs. The inventor is listed as William Shockley, right? But the patent belongs to Bell Labs.
Yes.
So my point is that he did get his pound of flesh, so to speak, right? He got what he deserved for inventing that. But Bell Labs ultimately benefited from it. And, the transistor, I don't think I really need to mention how important that was.
Well, then the question is, was his giving up his ability to control everything he makes worth the fact that he got a paycheck at a consistent basis.
And a Nobel Prize.
Yeah. Like, I certainly understand the point of he didn't nearly get the attributions that he probably should have for that invention. But I think that having a job and when you're working on stuff like that, it's the same with if we made something for Case Western in our research group. Case owns the idea technically, and I feel like that's just the balance you have to give, because I want a paycheck at the end of the day on a constant basis, and I'm willing to give it up. I mean, obviously, I could just go freelance and do whatever I want and see if I could just do it, but that would be hard.
Because ultimately there is a market for that. People will gladly pay a lump sum instead of a paycheck to someone if it's going to end up being lesser in the long term for a project they might not have to maintain as much.
I don't have a problem with people being paid to maintain software. That's not what I'm saying. The maintenance of the software is an ongoing service. I'm saying that the people who write the software are the ones that created the product, and anything past that is a service.
It seems as though, just thinking that on this surface level, that if you had a system set up where software devs write code, they patent code, that is theirs to sell, it's much more of it gives them a much higher incentive, I guess, to produce more, I guess, so that they could continue making profits. Does that seem to make sense?
Yes.
I can see that.
But not necessarily everything that you work on is going to profit the same. So it's not, I don't know, it's not necessarily as steady of a guarantee as like that weekly paycheck, I guess, if that makes sense.
Sure, but you still have to maintain the code that you made.
Right, that's true.
Speaking of maintenance, Kyle, or really anyone here, have you guys have heard of the ship of Theseus, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
In case this is still being recorded, the ship of Theseus, for reference, is just the idea of if you replace every single part on a ship, is that ship still the original? Well,
oh, I know that idea.
I'd like to apply that idea here. At what point, Kyle, does making the software become maintaining the software? Because at some point, at some level, the base software is never really strictly defined, is it?
Yeah, it would be version 1.0.0.
If it's an algorithm, for instance, it would be the substance of the algorithm. The implementation is not necessarily the point. The point is the process.
Okay.
Like, I should say the product, not the point. You know what I mean? So changing implementations would, instead of being replacing all the planks, it would be more changing the planks to be, made of steel or something instead of wood. So it's still, the same general idea. It's a boat.
Or
You know,
even
it
curing wood.
What?
Or even curing the wood.
Yes, so it's the same idea. The idea is what the product is.
So when you add a new feature that completely changes the product, how is that any different than just a new product?
It's not. Once it stops having any common functionality, then it becomes a different item.
Yeah, but I think it would be very difficult to define a line like that.
Well, sure. But, let me bring up another thing. I told this to James years ago. So we can agree that one grain of sand is not a heap of sand, right?
Sure.
Okay. How about two?
No.
Okay, how about a million?
Well, I don't know what data structure is it in. Is it actually in a? Okay, I'm making a
It's an
joke.
actual,
But I
yeah,
get
it's
your
an
point.
actual physical
wait.
heap of. So a million grains of sand would make a heap, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So it follows that a million minus one would still be a heap.
Right.
Not just because it's a -1.
Correct, but it's one grain of sand from a heap still makes a heap. Is my point.
Mm,
It could also depend on your perspective. Like to an ant, 10 could
Hit
seem
3
like
is the crowd.
could seem like a heap.
Well, let's
I think the question is, at one point, does it not become
Yeah.
a heap?
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, there's some interval where it exists as a heap, and then right on the other side of that, it exists as a not heap. So my point is the same thing with the ship of Theseus and what Brandon said. There is indeed a very fine line of where that demarcation comes in, but I do think that it does exist.
I think that it exists as a distribution of where people draw the line because everybody draws the line in a different spot.
Which is why I said it's difficult to draw the line.
Because there isn't one that you can just draw that everybody agrees with.
Yeah, I agree.
This conversation seems a lot like talking about how much power the government should have.
Oh,
Yeah.
In some
it
ways,
seems like a
that's
lot of different.
what open source is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that goes a lot. It kind of goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
It also goes hand in hand with net neutrality.
Yep. Oh.
So, as a whole, I agree with the Free Software Foundation's ideals, but some of the things I disagree with. But proprietary software, I guess, is just it's kind of a gray area to me.
I love open source software. I'm super glad it exists, and I'm perfectly fine with proprietary software existing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't want. I don't like restrictive EULAs. You know what I mean?
Understood, but you can have one, and you've got Windows that's an extremely easy to use, or Mac. Let's use Mac. Windows is weird. Mac is extremely easy to use and super reliable, and then you have Linux, where you have to basically be an IT or CS to understand how to use it. And yes, Ubuntu makes things a little better, but like
Get away.
you can't get a Windows experience from an open source software. It doesn't exist. It requires too much effort. Their ecosystem is, or Apple's ecosystem is very unique, and the things that they can provide with Swift is actually a really neat language that enables developers, and their APIs enable developers to create amazing software. I think they should be paid heavily for that.
Well, the thing is that Mac also derives itself from a Unix operating system,
which was not open source. Well, it was and it wasn't. It's Unix.
I believe it's based on Unix System V.
BSD, yeah. I believe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Berkeley.
Yeah, the Berkeley software distribution. So let's compare, let's say, open or free BSD to Mac OS, because they're derived from the same general kernel, right?
Yep. The kernel isn't really what defines an operating system at this point.
Well, yeah. I mean, I believe they're monolithic, aren't they?
Yeah.
I would imagine, based on the fact that BSD was older and microkernels were coming around at the point where Linux was created, which was after that.
Correct.
Minix was the first attempt, I think, at a microkernel.
Okay.
It's not entertaining because Linux is based off it and isn't a microkernel.
I know, but it has DLLs that make it even better because microkernels have task switching overhead. So it may be good from a logical point of view, but performance actually takes a hit.
Interesting.
So I think Linux is actually like, they allow you to be dynamic with DLLs and dynamically loading DLLs as drivers, but they also are monolithic architecture, so you don't have a ton of task switching between the operating system and the drivers and userland. It's just userland Linux. Sorry, tangent.
Oh, that's fine. So I guess what I'm saying is that if they're written, if they share a common code base, or at least they share a common ancestry, um, wouldn't that make them? Well, okay. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about the BSD license. Mac OS is able to be around because it's based on the BSD license.
And if it wasn't, it probably would still be around on a different kernel.
Right. But it wouldn't be a Unix operating system.
It probably would be in some way.
They
Because
would
those were it was either that or make your own.
The old expression goes, GNU is not Linux.
That's technically not wrong.
You were close, buddy.
Yes, GNL.
Okay, I have a hot take.
Go.
All academic software should be open source.
Yes.
Yeah, that actually sounds like a good idea.
Why is this ever a point of contention ever?
I don't. Well, because this kind of goes to what Kyle was talking about a bit. Is that if you make stuff in academia, a lot of them, if you make something of value, then go and start their own company.
Do you happen to be speaking of a certain senior design project?
No, I'm
No, none
speaking
of those
of various PhD students.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
There you go. Dr. Michael Ackerman. This does not look like him. He worked with our group a little while back, but I'm pretty sure he eventually left and started his own company and made tons of money off it. And that's a common thing. And I guess part of me is thinking, well, yeah, they did create it. But they were signed up in a job where, at least partially, they were funded by government money, especially if they were living off grant money. And
Not too uncommon.
Yeah, I mean,
I see what you're saying.
Especially if it was a lot of the healthcare stuff being funded by NIH, which is, that's where you get a lot of the grant money. That's pretty much that's all going to be tax money that people paid, and it should be available to the taxpayers, in my opinion.
What was he doing? Like something with neuroscience?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what it was.
Well, I mean, just generally, yeah. So stuff like that, yeah. I guess that kind of changes my mind slightly on the proprietary software thing. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the distribution of benefit is kind of skewed one way, and I don't like that. So yeah,
that's fair. I can agree with that. I think it does. There are all too often when it skews too far to just an overgrown business, without supporting the people that are really kind of the backbone.
Right. We're not assembly machines, we're people.
Unlike
and they're
HR.
making money. Right. But that's the thing, I mean, we have needs too, and we want to see our projects do well and stuff like that. But it's not just about pride. Pride isn't enough. And I guess what I'm saying is that if a company profits off of software that's created by their engineers, then the engineers shouldn't just be given a pat on the back.
No, they're given a salary. If the engineer could have made his own company, he would have. And you're welcome to do that anytime you want. They have the support to make an actual product. You're welcome to try.
May I counterpoint something that Kyle said just now?
Just give me 1 second. If you're welcome to try, but if you do try, we'll stomp you out of the market because we have billions of dollars and thousands of lawyers.
That's called anti-competitive practices, and generally that's where the government needs to come in. And I'm not whether it does or not is depends on how good the government is. Yes, I agree, but there are laws against things like price gouging and doing things like that. I think there were recently 2 medical companies that I saw in the news that were price gouging because they can team up and say, hey, we're the only 2 in this market. We can both increase our prices. And as long as we both do, then we're both going to make more money. And that's not considered legal. So yes, illegal practices are bad, but that again, those are illegal practices. I don't think that really counts.
Illegal in name only.
No, that is actually illegal. Price gouging is illegal.
I know what you're saying. It is illegal, but what I'm trying to say is that look at the companies that do it and compare that to the amount of prosecutions for it.
I don't know. I don't have the data.
I don't think that changes the morality of anything. And yes, also
at that point, then it would fall on the government on whether or not they've upheld their own laws in a proper way.
Right, yeah.
So yeah.
Well, that's an interesting discussion.
Yeah. This is pretty much what the class is like. A lot of times it's if it's a specific paper, like for this one, it was a lot of talking about the history and discussing it, and we usually try and stay on that. But as one kind of an off topic, it kind of makes sense that we kind of went in a bunch of different directions.
I just want to circle back to what John was saying. He said he had a counterpoint to something.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I lost track for a moment. So the counterpoint was when you work for a company, you provide your services to them. But that company, if your software does something that, say, harms someone or that holds the person who is responsible, quote unquote, for the property liable, then they are the ones liable, not you. They are the ones that have to shell out for the legal protections. They are the ones that have to shell out and be accountable for those cases. You, as an employee under them, in most cases would not, last I recall.
That's a good counterpoint.
Yeah.
Benefits and disadvantages to do it yourself. Make the decision yourself. Do you want to do something? Enter the market, create your own product? Fine. If you want to have the support of an entire company that knows how to do marketing and the documentation, like in medical, there's a crap ton of stuff.
Oh,
and I would not want a single team working on that. No, we have the support of a ton of teams that do an amazing job. And I would never in a million years attempt to start a company, a medical company.
So a good example, it's actually from recent experience. I used to work for the span of 2 weeks for a startup called, I think they were called at the time, Safecart. It was originally going to be a nonprofit, then it turned into a for-profit thanks to paperwork hell. So then the quote-unquote distribution of equity, unquote, came into idea. I can't speak much on the specifics of it because I'm under an NDA. However,
I'm not under the NDA.
What I can say, however, is the entire idea of the equity is that you would be held responsible in partial amount equal to your investment and worth in the company, as you would have been able to pull out from the company dependent upon the net worth.
Well, equity is you don't get equity when you just work as an employee.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I would have been a partial owner, and I pulled out because I was not emotionally or financially ready to be a partial owner of a company.
Me neither.
I think in the end,
I accounted for.
I think in the end, really, it comes down to a risk-reward type thing. Because obviously, the going into it and doing it yourself becomes a high risk but a very high possible reward. Whereas just getting a normal software job and giving up all my rights and letting other people do my stuff for me and losing control of what I write is just a low risk, low reward solution.
But you also still get a lot from that. You're not just getting a salary, even you're getting amazing support and fellow people who have great tools. They will provide you with an amazing, like, I got
but I want money.
A 6-core processor, and what I think Joey's probably got better than me, but
money.
They provide you with the ability to learn. They provide you with training. They provide you with a bunch of stuff so that even if you came out got fired, you'd have so much more experience from that. It's not like they're just providing you income.
Yeah, from working in a bigger company, just observing and also hearing about other people's co-ops and just the amount of money that is sloshed around for different purposes, for training programs, for departments that probably shouldn't be there because they're pointless, you know,
HR.
Like managers that you don't need, like, but like on top of that, like you also pay for benefits. It's not just people's salary. Like, there's a lot of money sloshed around. There's a lot of money waste. There's a lot of money that has to be brought in though to maintain salaries and benefits and all those expensive things. So like, I don't know. I understand why
lower reward.
Yeah, there you go.
But I don't know. I definitely can see, like, high risk, high reward has its merits,
right,
depending on how you look at it.
And definitely there is corruption in places where big corporations need to be cleaned up, where they could just stop so much money, you know, you need it's just a lot. And that would allow them to lower their prices and things like that, but I don't know.
Gotta have that golden parachute.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
In a society like this, a golden parachute's practically necessary. Whether that golden parachute is a couple $1,000 or a couple million. Unfortunately, that's the mentality. And that kind of goes into lobster mentality. People pull each other down in order to prop themselves up.
Hey, that's kind of my point, you know. I feel like the people who really profit off of the software that we write is really just they're people stepping on our backs to reach up things that they couldn't reach themselves.
Right, and I get that, and it's definitely an interesting topic, and I appreciate that you have that we've all, you know, shown different perspectives of it. I've learned a lot, and I don't know. I enjoy learning about other perspectives in a time when, like, it's everybody's so polarized about, you know, things in politics and you know, big business and whatever. You don't have to just shut down somebody else because of different other ideas from you, because there's other things to learn from them. So I appreciate the fact that we were able to have a civil discussion tonight and learn. I think this is a great format, Joey.
Yeah, this is the whole class too. If you guys get a chance, take the open source class.
It would definitely
Dr. Thomas does a really good job with it.
I wish I could have taken that. Dr. Thomas would do a great job.
I wish I could have taken that, but he kind of said, you know, he strongly recommends against it because I hadn't taken software development yet, which is reasonable, but made me feel bad.
Yeah, I'm realizing I'm missing a ton of stuff sometimes.
I gotta go take my dog out. I'll catch you guys later.
All right.
Later.
See you later, Kyle.
Thanks for talking with us.
See ya.
All right.
Good discussion.
Does anybody have anything else to add, or should we wrap
Not
it
in
up there?
particular. It's been a good talk, guys. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, sounds good. Thank you very much, Joey, for preparing the presentation, doing a fantastic presentation, and then for the good conversation,
it's the easiest
guys.
one I've had to do.
Yeah, because you already had it prepared for your
I already
class.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks for coming, guys. We will see you in 2 weeks, hopefully, for the next meeting.
Later.
See you later.
Yeah, see ya.
Cool, thanks.